Welcome to our deep dive. And today, it's into a world that you might not think too much about,
Ooh, yeah.
scientific misconduct.
No.
We're going to be using the Wikipedia article on scientific misconduct to guide our deep dive.
Okay.
And we're really going to kind of go into it. I mean, why would scientists even do this?
Right.
What are the ways that it kind of rears its ugly head? And what kind of impact does it have on science and just society in general?
Yeah, it's fascinating because you think about science as being this really objective pursuit
Right.
of truth.
Mm-hmm.
But when you start looking at the misconduct,
Yeah.
it really reveals that human side of science.
Yeah, and sometimes those human flaws
Yeah.
lead to some pretty serious,
Yeah.
problems.
Absolutely.
So let's start with the why.
Okay.
Why would a scientist, somebody who's dedicated to expanding our knowledge,
Right.
why would they ever commit misconduct?
Well, one of the biggest contributing factors is the pressure to publish findings. In academia, they call it publish or perish.
Oh, yeah.
And essentially your career, your funding, your reputation,
Mm.
all hinges on getting your work published in these really prestigious journals.
Yeah, it's almost like this high-stakes game, but
Yeah.
instead of getting points, you're trying to rack up all these publications.
Exactly.
Right.
And that can lead people to cut corners.
Right.
Maybe fudge the data,
Right.
omit results that are kind of inconvenient, or even fabricate entire experiments.
I was going to say, make stuff up
Yeah.
just to get that publication.
Just to get published.
Wow. And you wouldn't believe how often photo manipulation happens.
Really?
There was a study that was done and found that almost 20% of scientific images
Yeah.
had some kind of inappropriate alteration to them. And it's a reminder that, we look at visual data and we think that's objective,
Right.
but even that can be manipulated.
Yeah. And it's not just individual ambition that's driving this. Institutions themselves are also under pressure to secure grant funding,
Yeah.
produce, groundbreaking results.
Right.
And this can lead to a culture where, maybe cutting corners is just kind of overlooked.
Yeah. Or even, it's
Accepted?
accepted.
Yeah. Tacitly accepted.
Tacitly accept. That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
So it's like a systemic issue as well as an individual.
Right.
Now, somebody listening to this might think, well, wait a minute. Isn't scientific research all about verifying results
Right.
and replicating them? So wouldn't fake data be exposed?
Well, that is the ideal,
Right.
but in reality,
Yeah.
it's not always that simple.
Okay.
Replicating research, especially in fields with a lot of variables,
Yeah.
it can be incredibly difficult.
Right.
So it's not always as easy to catch fabricated data.
Mm.
And sometimes it goes years before it's discovered.
Wow.
Yeah.
So it's really, it is a problem.
It is.
And the Wikipedia article actually mentions a motive that I found kind of cynical.
Okay. So in certain fields, scientists might be tempted to skew the research
Right.
to favor a corporation that is funding their work. Or in the article, it even brings up some psychologists that provided favorable testimony in legal cases just for financial gain.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that science, just like any other field,
Mm-hmm.
can be vulnerable to corruption.
Yeah, kind of disillusioning
It is.
to think that this pursuit of knowledge can be, affected by financial interests.
Right. But it's important to remember these cases are the exception,
Okay.
not the rule.
Okay, good.
The vast majority of scientists are committed to ethical research.
Well, that's good to hear.
Yeah.
So we've got this pressure cooker environment.
Yes.
We've got money, all these things mixed in.
Uh-huh.
So let's dive into how this actually shows up.
Okay.
How does this misconduct actually manifest?
Well, the National Science Foundation defines 3 major types of research misconduct.
Okay.
And it's important to note that this is specific to the U.S. Okay, so other countries might have different definitions.
Might have slightly different definitions.
Okay.
But these are widely recognized. And those are fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism.
Yeah.
So think of it like this.
Okay.
Fabrication is like writing a fictional science paper.
Okay.
So you're literally just making up data or results.
Wow, so it's just completely made up.
Completely made up. And
Right.
there's even a term for this. They call it dry labbing,
Dry labbing.
which means you're inventing results without ever conducting the experiment.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's fabrication. What about falsification?
Falsification involves manipulating the research materials or the process
Okay.
or the data to get a desired outcome. So imagine a chef
Okay.
that alters a recipe just to make sure the cake turns out perfectly even if that means leaving out key ingredients.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good analogy.
Yeah, so that's kind of what falsification is.
Okay, and plagiarism, I mean, most people are familiar with that from school.
Right? It's taking somebody else's ideas, words, or research findings and presenting them as your own without giving credit.
Okay, so those are the big three.
The big three.
But the article goes on to talk about a bunch of other things that are less obvious,
Right.
but are still problematic forms of misconduct.
Yes.
One that I thought was interesting is citation plagiarism.
Oh, yeah. Citation plagiarism. That's essentially failing to cite relevant prior research.
Okay.
And doing that to make your own work seem more original and groundbreaking.
So you're kind of trying to rewrite history to make yourself
exactly
the hero.
Yeah.
Even though you didn't do all the work.
Right. And then in research fields where visual data is really important,
okay,
like microscopy, photo manipulation becomes a big issue.
Yeah, I can imagine.
So, researchers might alter images to misrepresent data.
Yeah.
Maybe splicing together different images,
Wow.
tweaking brightness, contrast, to hide details that are inconvenient to their findings.
And then there's those shady practices like ghostwriting and guest authorship.
Right. What are your thoughts on those?
I mean, I don't know.
Well, both of them raise serious ethical questions.
Yeah.
Ghostwriting is when somebody else writes the paper, but a scientist puts their name on it.
Right.
And a lot of times that's to hide conflicts of interest.
Oh, yeah.
Especially when research is funded by corporations.
It's like, hiring a ghostwriter to write your autobiography. You get the fame.
Right.
But somebody else did the work.
Yeah.
So what about guest authorship?
Guest authorship is adding big-name researchers to a paper. Even though they didn't really contribute much, just to boost its credibility and chances of publication.
So it's like inviting a celebrity to your party?
Exactly.
Just to impress your friends, even though they don't really know you?
That's a perfect analogy. And then there's another issue that the article brings up called helicopter research.
Okay, I haven't heard of that one.
This is when researchers from wealthy countries drop into developing countries, collect data, and then fly back home and publish their findings. Without involving or crediting local scientists.
Wow. That just sounds incredibly exploitative.
It is. It's a form of scientific colonialism.
Yeah.
They're essentially extracting valuable data and knowledge from a region, but they're not contributing to its scientific development.
Right.
So it raises all sorts of ethical questions about power dynamics and equity in research.
Yeah. It's a good reminder that misconduct isn't just about fudging numbers.
Right.
It can have implications for communities.
Absolutely.
And, really affect how we understand the world.
And it underscores the need for these ethical guidelines and practices, especially in this globalized research environment we have now.
So we've explored the why.
Yes.
And now we've explored the how.
The forms it takes.
The forms.
Yeah.
So let's move on to the responsibilities and the consequences.
Okay.
Because it's not just the scientists.
Right.
Yeah.
It's the institutions. They work for their peers.
Right, the journals that publish.
For journals, everybody's involved.
So let's start with the authors.
Okay.
Like, what are the responsibilities?
Well, the scientific community expects all authors to have thoroughly checked the data before submitting it for publication.
Makes sense.
And there are also rules against submitting the same findings to multiple journals at the same time.
Okay.
So you can't just shop it around and try to get double publication credit.
Oh, I see. So no sneaky double submissions.
No sneaky submissions. And as we talked about earlier, ghostwriting and guest authorship are considered serious ethical breaches.
So people have been called out for that.
Yes. The article mentions specific cases of scientists that have been accused of misconduct because they didn't properly check data or they were added as an author just for their reputation.
Wow.
So it really highlights how important it is for authors to take responsibility for the work that they're putting their name on.
It makes you wonder how often those things happen.
Yeah.
And they're never detected.
It's hard to say, but it's definitely a concern.
Yeah.
And that's why it's so important to have really robust systems in place to detect this and address it when it does happen.
Now let's zoom out a little bit and look at the institutions where these researchers work.
Right.
I mean, they have a huge responsibility to prevent this stuff.
Absolutely.
And investigate it.
Right. But this is where things get really tricky.
Okay.
Because institutions often face conflicts of interest.
Oh, yeah.
When they're investigating their own scientists.
It's like asking the fox to guard the henhouse.
Exactly.
Yeah.
A university might be hesitant to expose misconduct
Right.
because it could damage their reputation and their funding. And conducting thorough investigations is expensive.
So there's a financial disincentive
Right.
to, digging too deep.
Unfortunately, that's often the case.
Wow.
And in many countries,
Uh-huh.
getting research funding based on fraudulent data
Okay.
is not even a legal offense.
Wow.
So universities don't necessarily have a strong incentive
Right.
to investigate allegations rigorously or act on those findings.
That's a problem.
It is a big problem.
It almost seems like the system is set up to protect the institution and not the integrity of the science.
Unfortunately, that can be the case.
So that's where the role of peers comes in.
Right. What's the responsibility of scientists who suspect their colleagues of engaging in misconduct?
Right.
Should they report it?
Yeah.
Even if it means risking their own careers or relationships?
That's a tough question.
It is. It's a tough dilemma.
Nobody wants to be a whistleblower, but somebody has to speak up.
Right. Otherwise, this kind of behavior just continues.
Exactly.
And fostering that culture of speaking up is really vital for upholding scientific integrity.
Yeah.
The article suggests having clear reporting mechanisms and protections for whistleblowers can make a big difference.
So creating a system where people feel safe coming forward.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got the scientists, we've got the institutions.
Right.
Let's talk about the journals.
The journals, they're kind of the gatekeepers of the scientific record.
Right, because they publish this stuff.
Exactly. And they play a critical role in identifying and addressing potential misconduct.
Okay.
And there's a committee called the Committee on Publication Ethics, or COPE.
Okay.
And they've established guidelines for journals to follow when they're dealing with questionable research.
So there are protocols.
There are protocols.
Like what kind of actions can they take?
Well, the guidelines outline various actions, like retracting papers, issuing expressions of concern, or publishing corrections.
Okay, so they can take action.
They can take action.
But do they always?
That's a good question. And unfortunately, there's evidence that they don't. The article mentions several cases where journals were aware of potential misconduct, but they didn't take appropriate action.
Oh, wow.
Sometimes they even allowed problematic papers to remain published.
Wow. That's really undermining the whole system.
It is. It really underscores the need for greater transparency and accountability within the publishing process.
So we've talked about the scientists.
Yes.
We've talked about the institutions. We've talked about the journals.
Right.
Now let's talk about the consequences.
Okay, the consequences of this kind of misconduct.
Because it's not just the individual researcher.
It goes way beyond.
Yeah, like what are some of the things that can happen?
On a scientific level, misconduct can distort research agendas. And waste valuable resources.
Right, because people are trying to replicate this stuff.
Exactly. Imagine scientists spending years trying to replicate or refute fraudulent findings.
Yeah, it's like building a house on a foundation of sand.
Exactly. The whole thing is eventually going to collapse.
Yeah.
And sometimes the consequences go beyond wasted time and money.
Oh, really?
The article highlights some real-world examples where misconduct had a direct impact on people's lives.
Okay.
For example, the Piltdown Man hoax.
Oh, wow.
This set back our understanding of human evolution for decades.
Wow, that's incredible.
Those fabricated fossils were so convincing that they led scientists down the wrong path for years.
Yeah.
And it really obscured the true picture of our evolutionary history.
Oh, wow.
And then there's the case of Dr. Alfred Steinschneider, who fabricated research on instant sleep apnea and sudden infant death syndrome, or SUDEs.
Right.
And his research was wrongly cited in legal cases involving parents accused of harming their children.
Oh, wow.
So it really highlights how these fraudulent findings can have devastating consequences.
I mean, just to think about the ripple effect of that.
It's hard to fathom.
Yeah.
And then there's another case, the case of Professor Don Poldermans.
Okay.
And this shows how impactful this can be in the medical field.
Okay.
He was reporting on treatments to prevent death and heart attacks during surgery.
Okay.
And his reports were fraudulent.
Oh, no.
And they led to incorrect guidelines being used for years across North America and Europe.
Wow, so it can really affect healthcare.
Yeah, it's a sobering reminder that these aren't just abstract academic issues.
Right.
They have real-world implications for healthcare.
And people's well-being.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, so consequences can be really profound.
Very profound.
And let's not forget about the consequences for the whistleblowers.
Right. They often face retaliation,
Yeah.
ostracism, damage to their careers just for speaking out.
Right.
And this creates what they call a chilling effect.
Okay.
Where it discourages others from coming forward.
Yep.
And it allows this kind of misconduct to just fester.
Yeah. So there's a lot at stake here.
There is?
But it's not all doom and gloom.
No, it's not.
The Wikipedia article talks about some of the ways that technology is being used to help with this.
Yeah.
Like to detect and prevent it.
Right. Especially when it comes to data.
Oh, okay. Tell me more about that.
For instance, there are databases like Deja Vu that use data mining to flag potential cases of plagiarism and duplicate publications. Wow. It's like having a digital detective.
Right.
Constantly scanning the scientific literature.
Yeah, looking for any foul play.
Yeah.
So it's getting harder to get away with this stuff.
It is definitely.
Yeah, good.
And another tool is error analysis.
Okay.
By examining patterns of error in data, scientists can sometimes spot irregularities that might suggest fabrication or manipulation.
Interesting.
And there's a growing movement towards increased data sharing.
Yeah, I've heard about this.
So the idea is that if researchers are required to make their raw data available, it makes it harder to manipulate or fabricate results.
It also makes it easier for others to verify the findings.
Exactly.
And, you know, build on the research.
And do it in a transparent way.
Right.
So there are definitely positive developments.
Good.
But the article makes a point that's a little bit sobering.
Oh, okay.
Even with thousands of retractions happening each year, experts believe that the vast majority of misconduct probably goes underreported. So even though we have these systems, they're still vulnerable to human failings.
Wow. So how much bad science is out there that we just don't know about?
Yeah, that's a valid concern.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to remember that the vast majority of scientists are dedicated to pursuing knowledge ethically.
Okay.
And rigorously.
Yeah, that's reassuring.
It is.
But it sounds like we have a lot of work to do.
We do.
To address these systemic issues that, you know, contribute to this misconduct.
Yeah. Yeah, it really does highlight that.
Yeah.
And it also kind of underscores the importance of integrity and accountability in science, from the individual researcher to institutions and journals.
Yeah.
And speaking of accountability, the Wikipedia article gives a really interesting example from a regulatory perspective. It talks about the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission, or the NRC, and how they handled deliberate misconduct in their licensed activities.
Okay, so that sounds intense.
It is.
Like, what kind of regulations are we talking about?
Well, they have specific regulations in place to address things like providing false information or engaging in deliberate acts that compromise safety. And violating these regulations can lead to some serious consequences.
Oh, really?
Like termination fines and even criminal prosecution.
Wow. So we're not just talking about, you know, slaps on the wrist.
No, not at all.
These are serious repercussions.
Yes, very serious.
So in some fields, scientific integrity isn't just ethical. It's a legal concern.
It can be.
With real-world implications.
For public safety.
And the consequences can really be career-ending for individuals.
It makes you wonder if other fields should adopt something similar. Yeah, that's a really interesting question.
Especially those with direct implications for public health and safety.
Right, because it would certainly raise the stakes and potentially deter some researchers from engaging in misconduct. But of course, it also raises those complex legal and ethical questions about how you actually define and enforce those regulations.
Right, because you can't just have a blanket statement. You have to really define it.
You have to be very specific.
So it's something to think about.
Definitely something to consider.
Now let's kind of shift gears a little bit and talk about the impact of all of this on public trust in science.
Yeah.
Because it seems like every time there's a big case of fraud or retraction, it just chips away at that trust a little bit more.
Absolutely. You're right.
Yeah.
Public trust in science is essential for its continued success.
Right.
I mean, when that trust is eroded, it becomes harder to secure funding for research, to implement evidence-based policies, even to have productive conversations about these scientific issues.
It's like this vicious cycle. You know, misconduct leads to distrust, and then that distrust makes it harder to address the underlying causes of the misconduct.
It's a tough problem with no easy solutions.
Yeah.
But I think one of the most important things we can do is promote greater transparency.
Okay, how do we do that?
Well, that means making data and methods more accessible.
Okay.
Encouraging open peer review. And fostering a culture where scientists feel comfortable questioning each other's work.
So it's about being open.
Yes.
And accountable.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
And I think it's also about educating the public.
Okay.
About how science actually works.
Yeah.
The inherent uncertainties involved. And that science is a process of refinement.
Right.
And self-correction.
So we shouldn't look at science as this, like, perfect,
it's not
infallible thing.
It's not about presenting science as this source of truth. It's about presenting it as this rigorous process that's constantly evolving. Yeah. Science is constantly being challenged and revised as new evidence emerges.
That's what makes it so powerful.
It does.
But it also means that we should always be questioning
yes,
and critically evaluating these claims.
Absolutely, even those that come from well-respected sources.
So it's about being a critical consumer of information.
Exactly.
Regardless of where it's coming from.
Regardless of the source.
Okay, so as we kind of wrap up this deep dive into scientific misconduct, I want to leave our listeners with some questions to think about.
I love that idea.
Yeah.
These questions kind of build on what we've talked about, but they push a bit further.
Okay.
They invite you to consider the broader societal impacts of this misconduct and how we can address them.
So the first question is, if you were tasked with designing a system to prevent or detect scientific misconduct, what would be your top priorities? What changes would you make to the way research is funded, conducted, and published to kind of minimize this risk?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
It really challenges you to think about the system.
Yeah.
And then another question to consider is, given what we've learned about the pressures that can lead to misconduct, how can we as a society better support those scientists who are committed to ethical research?
It's about recognizing that the system is kind of incentivizing certain behaviors.
Exactly.
And how can we change that?
Right. How can we shift those incentives to promote integrity?
Yeah. So it's not just about punishing bad behavior. It's about rewarding the good behavior.
We need to create a culture where ethical research is not just valued, but rewarded.
Well said.
Thank you.
So I encourage our listeners to explore these questions further.
Yeah.
To think about, those real life cases of misconduct. And the debates about how to address them.
It's a fascinating area.
It is, because understanding these challenges is essential for anybody who values knowledge and wants to make sure that science is benefiting humanity in a responsible and ethical way.
Yeah, in a way that's good for everyone.
Yeah, so keep learning and stay curious.
And remember, even in a world of information overload, critical thinking is your most valuable tool.
That's a good point.
Don't just accept these scientific findings at face value. Question those assumptions. Consider different perspectives and always be curious.
Yeah, that's the true spirit of a learner.
It is.
So we've really gone in depth.
We have.
Into the world of scientific misconduct.
Yeah.
Uncovered a lot of the pressures, the temptations.
Right, the human failings. That can lead to this breach of trust.
But we've also talked about some of the ways that the scientific community is trying to address these challenges.
Yeah, using technology, ethical guidelines, a greater emphasis on transparency and accountability.
And I think it's important to point out that even with all these challenges, science is still one of the best tools that we have to understand the world.
Yes, one of the most powerful tools.
And to improve our lives.
Absolutely.
But the key is to approach it with a critical eye.
Yes, to be aware of the potential for bias and error.
Right. And not just rely on one source.
Exactly. Seek out multiple perspectives.
So what does this all mean for you as a learner?
That's a good question.
Well, it means that you have a responsibility to engage with science in a thoughtful and informed way.
Yeah.
Don't just accept everything that you read or hear.
Question things.
Question, dig deeper, think about the sources.
Absolutely.
And remember, learning is a continuous process.
It is.
Even those established scientific facts can be overturned when new evidence emerges.
Yeah, science is always evolving.
Exactly. So stay curious. Keep exploring.
Yes.
And never stop questioning.
That's the key.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It was my pleasure.
And until next time, happy learning.